Hello, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm Lisa Harker. I'm Director of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. Welcome to this webinar on families' experiences of separation and support. Each year, many thousands of parents decide to end their relationship as a couple. And while many people in this situation do not use the family court at all, there have been concerns about the rising number of private law cases in the family justice system. This has prompted a renewed focus on how families that are separating might be supported, particularly out of court. At the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, we have been aiming to provide research to help us better understand families' experiences of separation and court proceedings. It is our hope that this work will help judges, lawyers, mediators, social workers, and policymakers to have better informed discussions about how to make better support families and ensure future developments reflect parents' and children's needs. Today, we'll be hearing about the findings of a study carried out by the University of Bristol, published at the end of last year. The research tells us more about the support that parents want and why, and importantly, how children can feel when their parents separate. During the event, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions and share your thoughts. But first, I'm delighted to say Sir Andrew McFarlane, President of the Family Division, now joins us to introduce today's event. Welcome, Sir Andrew.
Thank you very much, Lisa. As your remarks suggest, there is a context in which this research lands. And as it happens, although these things don't happen entirely by chance, but as it happens, the context in which it lands and is being presented now in early 2023 is ripe for this information. And the research is, to my eyes, extremely valuable. The context, as many of you who are attending this webinar will know, is that for many years, those involved in family justice have been urging the government and other agencies to improve the landscape around the court, the hinterland in which people live their lives before they even realize that they need to come to court, let alone want to come to court to litigate issues about the arrangements for their children. I have been banging on about this for a long time, but in particular, matters crystallized with the report What About Me by the Family Solutions Group, which was published in 2021, and about which I spoke in a speech in Jersey in October of that year. And in that speech, I said that improving support for separating parents who do not need to come to court was my number one priority in the remainder of my time as president. That speech coincided, as it happened, with the ebb and flow of political appointment, with the arrival of Dominic Raab as Lord Chancellor and Deputy Prime Minister. And I'm very appreciative of the Deputy Prime Minister and Lord Bellamy, the relevant minister in the department, and indeed particularly the staff at the MOJ, for the way in which they decided to pick up this issue and look at just what could be done to support parents who separate without them coming to court. Because, as I've said many times, we inside the court can do all we can to make the arrangements as effective as possible within the court process. And my golly, we do try, and my goodness, we need to keep on trying. But we just cannot engage with people who are separating today and haven't issued a court application because we simply don't know they exist. And it's in that period, that gauntlet, that people might have to run between beginning to separate. And as this research shows, it's a process. It's not something that happens on a day and ending up in court. There needs to be engagement with them in that stage. I hope with some confidence that the fruit of the MOJ endeavour over the last 18 months may be a consultation document, but it's not for me to speak about that. If it does, then this research obviously is entirely ripe and appropriate to be before us at this stage. But even if it doesn't, the research gives us a new insight. I don't think we've had this material of this sort before, a qualitative, in-depth understanding of what a fairly good number of parents and children in different circumstances have to say about these various issues. And loud and clear, really at the top of the headline points in the research, is that one's chances of getting it right and having a better separation, as the Australians say, a smarter separation, depends to a fair extent on the degree of support and information and the way in which you're able to connect with well-resourced networks at the time of separation. And of course, awfully, if you've got some money and some resources behind you, that's easier for you and you're likely to have a softer landing. But it shouldn't be dependent on money, and it shouldn't be a postcode lottery. There should be a uniform, available to all level of support, information, resource for people who separate. And it's that target that I've been pushing on for the last 18 months or so. None of this is rocket science. For parents to separate and feel they've got to invent the wheel for the first time for them and that their situation is in some way unique is entirely wrong. It's extremely important to them, but they need help as to what normal looks like and what they might be thinking about and how they might do it. So the insight we get from this report, and that you all get with me as we listen to the presentation during the rest of this webinar, is really very important material to inform what we do as we look to move forward and improve the resources for people. The only other point I want to stress, because I don't want to talk too much tonight, I want to listen to what's being said, is the fact that research shows that the children that were spoken to and the older young people who were spoken to felt they hadn't been told enough by their parents about the process of separation. If it's going to work, it's got to bring the whole family along with it. It's not something that children are going to welcome if they feel arrangements have been imposed on them. And again, standing on the outside, looking at someone else's family or reading about someone else's family in this report, that's probably easy to see, but it's harder to see when you're in the middle of it, when it's you, when it's your parents, when it's your children, it's your separation. So we need somehow to bottle that message about keeping children informed, keeping children involved, and including that in any information and guidance that's given. So as ever, I'm extremely grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for supporting the Family Justice Observatory, and I'm extremely impressed by, yet again, the good nous and good sense of the FJO for spotting this topic, rolling their sleeves up and getting on with this research. It's extremely valuable. Thank you for asking me to introduce today, but I think now we need to get on with the meat of the evening and listen to the contributions. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you, Sir Andrew. Thank you for those really helpful introductory remarks and for joining us at today's event. Well, in a moment, we are going to watch a presentation on the University of Bristol research. It was led by Dr. John Simons, who's Senior Lecturer in Social Work with Children and Families at the University of Bristol. And the team worked with families across Wales and in the southwest of England to gain an understanding of their experiences and their support needs, both in and out of court. The team will explain more about the background to the research and the findings and their recommendations. And we're also going to hear views from parents and children. Their names and their voices have been changed for confidentiality. Finally, we're going to move on to a panel discussion where members of the research team will answer questions from you, the audience. We've received a lot of questions in advance, and thank you so much to everyone who sent questions in beforehand. But please also use the chat tab to share any other questions. I can see them already coming in and comments that you have. We're going to try and address as many questions and comments as we can today, but please be rest assured that all of your comments will be read by the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory team, and this will help us shape future research and events. If you've got any general questions relating to the research that is being presented, please also post your questions in the chat. and the researchers will respond to as many of those as they can, and will follow up with any specific questions or feedback after the event. Finally, we're recording this webinar, so you can visit this content again if you wish by visiting the events section of our website. That's nuffieldfjo.org.uk, and you'll find recordings of other events there too. But without further ado, I'll now hand over to the University of Bristol team.
This research was commissioned by the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and it was undertaken by a multidisciplinary team of academics at Bristol University. The aim was to understand more about the experiences of separating families and the impact that that had on children and parents. So we explored the issues that they faced during the separation and the support that they received and what they valued from that support. We also explored what we can learn from families who have been through a separation and how things might be improved in the future. We did in-depth qualitative research with families to hear from them in their own words about their experiences of separation. We sent them digital cameras with some prompts for them to make 4 video reflections about their experiences. And then these recordings formed the basis for in-depth interviews, which we did with them online afterwards. We included children and young people as well, and we sent out packs of craft activities which reflected the topics of the 4 reflections, so that they could share their thoughts and feelings about the separation as well. Altogether, we spoke to 42 family members across the southwest of England and Wales, 16 mothers, 14 fathers, and 12 children. And in terms of ethnicity, we invited people to define their own ethnicity. 32 participants described themselves as white British, 6 as black British, 1 as Welsh, 1 as Jewish, 1 as South African, and 1 as Eastern European. One of our key findings is that separation is a process, not a single event. Parents had experienced a number of difficulties in the relationship that led up to the separation before they made the decision to separate. And they'd made a number of attempts to resolve these difficulties along the way, using up kind of emotional resources and capacity in the relationship to manage that. By the time that they decided to separate, they felt that they had done their best to resolve the difficulties in the relationship. When parents decided to separate, they had to make a number of different arrangements as part of the process. So the separation wasn't marked by a single event, for example, a legal recognition of the separation. And they were more likely to focus on things like emotional aspects of the separation or financial markers of the process. And each of those required further negotiations. So it often extended over a period of time before they felt that the separation was complete. For children and young people that spoke to us, they felt that often the separation was never complete. And it evolved according to the different circumstances of their parents, about where they lived, for example. But also as the children got older, then sometimes their wishes and feelings about the separation changed, and they might want to spend more or less time with each parent. And each of these had to be negotiated. When parents separated, they had to make a number of different arrangements and were likely to face a wide range of challenges. Obviously, there were emotional challenges to the separation, financial challenges, including arrangements for child maintenance, decisions to be made about housing and who would live where, arrangements for the children around how their care would be managed, and issues also about how to provide the right kind of information to children at the right time and involve them in the decisions that they were taking. These issues didn't necessarily stand alone and sometimes interacted with each other. So, for example, issues around housing had the potential to impact on other areas of the family's life. If families had to remain living together, then this could raise emotional tensions. And also when parents moved out, but they didn't have adequate or local accommodation, this could have serious implications for their ability to maintain their relationships with their children. So these practical issues had very real consequences for the impact on children and their parents.
And their whole separation kind of caused a lot of conflict within the house, whilst they're still living under the same roof, which would have been 2 or 3 years.
Well, where he moved into was a lad that I also knew, and I knew he had problems, like he was drinking and things like that. So there was no way I was letting my daughter go to his house.
Financially, right now, I can't really afford to drive an hour away. With the price of fuel at the moment, it's tough. I don't know how to negotiate that with him without him blowing it out of proportion and exploding at me.
Experiences of separation were significantly shaped by access to resources. So those with access to supportive, informed and well-resourced networks received good levels of support from friends and family. This included getting legal advice or practical help, financial support, or help finding new accommodation from their wider family. Those with more material resources had increased options for managing the separation. For example, being able to access appropriate housing quickly or being able to pay for legal advice. As a result, they were better able to navigate the practical and emotional challenges of separation. Those without access to such resources struggled much more in protecting the children from the impact of separation. Emotional and relational resources were also key to being able to negotiate with their ex-partner. When parents found it hard to manage their distress, conflict and tension could become entrenched, making it much more difficult to manage the separation. Parents described a wide variety of sources of support. When support was experienced as positive, it was characterised as being accessible, informative, realistic and emotionally aware. Friends and family were among the most important sources of support for participants in the study. Participants valued the support from friends and family because they were most available and provided high levels of emotional and practical support, but did also explain that sometimes friends and family were not very realistic and could give poor information. Parents found it difficult to find reliable information online about what their options were or advice about what they could expect. They tended to get information from people they knew or once they had begun working with more formal services. However, those formal services often had costs attached, which meant that they weren't always experienced as readily accessible. Most of the participants that we spoke to who had used counselling really valued it. For them, counselling provided a space for them to process their feelings about the separation, about the end of the relationship, and the difficulties in the negotiations. And this was valued greatly by them. What counselling isn't set up to provide is information or advice or guidance about the separation process. So although counselling was able to provide lots of emotional support, participants needed to look somewhere else for advice and guidance. The parents we spoke to had mixed experiences of mediation. They tended not to draw a distinction between mediation itself and the MIAM. A MIAM is a mediation, information and assessment meeting. This showed a lack of understanding of the process. There were examples of parents finding mediation helpful, and where they did, they received information and signposting which assisted them. More of the parents in the sample described mediation negatively. There were some participants in the sample who wanted mediation to provide individualised advice and guidance. However, this is not what mediation typically can offer, and this suggests a mismatch between what parents felt they needed and what mediation could offer. Some parents describe mediation as a distressing experience because the mediator was not effectively able to identify and manage the power dynamic between the parents, or where mediation took place in the context of domestic abuse. When seeking formal advice and guidance, some had good experience with solicitors, but there were significant barriers to access these because of the cost and unavailability of legal aid. In addition, parents try to avoid this route if possible because of concerns about the repercussions in the relationship. Court was commonly described as the last resort by parents rather than a means of offering an easy route to dispute resolution. Parents explained that court was something to be avoided if possible because of the expense, stress, or the likelihood of increased conflict in the relationship. Only a small number of our participants had experience of the court, but those that did almost always described it negatively. Parents felt it was an alien and intimidating environment with unfamiliar processes. When parents did go to court, those who needed to represent themselves experienced a number of difficulties. The court environment was strange and unfamiliar to parents and did not always enable them to feel heard and understood. Similarly, children who had experienced court did not feel that they had been listened to or believed, although when Cafcass Cymru had listened to the child, this was experienced more positively. When court orders were granted, they provided an authoritative decision for that moment. For some parents, this represented a basis for agreement, but there was also a sense that it did not take account of changing circumstances.
The parents we spoke to explained how they'd aimed to prioritise and protect children throughout the separation process. And they gave us examples of how they had attempted to push down or suppress negative emotions towards their ex-partner for the sake of their children, and how they'd really tried to resolve disagreements with their ex-partner so that relationships could be maintained. However, some parents reflected on how challenging this was while they were in some emotional distress. And there were differences between some parents' understanding of the impact on children and what children themselves told us. Children often described how they could see how difficult their parents were finding the separation process, and they recognised how challenging it was for their parents, alongside also feeling some really difficult emotions themselves.
The things that were important to me after we separated was how it impacted the girls, how I didn't want it to impact them too much.
Although we weren't very amicable, we wanted it to be amicable for the children, and the children not to see any upset or any struggles or arguments.
So it was really hard, the first part. It was a lot of angry messages, back and forth. Yes, lots of tears, really emotional. I found it really hard to accept that it was real.
But going through that was extremely difficult, just mentally, physically, emotionally. Sorry, not physically, emotionally. I was in tears many nights.
It wasn't until a few months later that I realised that she'd met someone else, and it completely crushed my dad. It was so hard to see them both like that. And I think, combined with the pandemic, I felt out of control with my home life.
The children that we spoke to often described being more aware of the dynamics of the separation than their parents sometimes realised or acknowledged. And the separation of children's parents impacted them both emotionally and practically in their everyday lives. It was described often as an upsetting time, and many children and young people found out about their parents' separation in ways which didn't help their understanding, and that contributed to further distress.
I did get told one day, "Oh, we are getting a divorce," but it was so casual that it was almost like nothing. And when my mum moved out, she didn't actually tell me, and she took my brother with her. I remember my sister knew, my dad knew, but no one had actually told me.
Then she found more messages and just was throwing his suitcase and things down the stairs, and that's how my little sister found out.
I didn't think they told me, but it was very obvious. One day we woke up, whatever. He was acting strange, but me and my brother didn't think of it. But I was at school, so I don't know what happened. And then he obviously didn't come. Well, no, he tried to come, I think in the evening, but our mum wouldn't let him in. The police were here.
Children gave us detailed examples of how their parents' separation had impacted on their day-to-day lives, and also how they felt about those arrangements. Children didn't always feel that the arrangements took sufficient account of the impact that they would have on their day-to-day lives, on their worlds, and they wanted adults to understand this better. There seems to be something of a mismatch between the universal parental aim to protect and prioritise their children and how that is then experienced by the children themselves. It shouldn't be assumed that parents don't think a separation and how it's handled might affect children. All of the parents in our sample understood that there could be negative consequences resulting from the separation process on their children. But we might need to give more focus to helping parents understand exactly what it is that children need and how parents can provide this. The way that parents might try to protect their children might not marry with what children tell us they need in terms of information given, the way information is communicated, and their involvement in decision making. And children in our research were often left feeling in the dark and somewhat powerless. Lots of young people reflected on what could have been better for them, themselves, and also for other children and young people who were affected by family separation. For some, this was quite simple, things such as acknowledging the situation with the child, acknowledging that the situation is difficult, rather than trying to shield the child from view, gloss over the difficulties of the separation.
It was like twice a week after school and one day at the weekend, and it was just a lot. Like, we didn't know if we were coming or going. I was getting ill and things because of it. I feel very angry with him because he wouldn't listen to what I said. Like, for me, it would have been so much better if people had just listened to me. I think that my mum dealt with it really well because she always treated me in a way that meant she understood that I understood. I think that parents need to be mindful of the fact that their children understand, in most cases, what's going on.
And instead of doubting me and constantly questioning and trying to enforce that what they're saying is right, believe them and then give them opportunities, like let them know that if they change their mind in the future, that's okay.
Don't act like nothing has happened, because that's not good.
There needs to be support in place for the parents. Maybe, if they don't get along, they want to co-parent. There's not the facilities there. But they don't get along. They don't want to be in each other's presence, I guess. You know, support in place for that, I guess. Because it does come down to an innocent child that becomes very stressed and very overwhelmed. And that's just not fair at all.
So moving forwards, we need to think really carefully about the detail of how we're going to support parents in the act of providing information to children, in effective ways of communicating this sometimes difficult information to children, and also support parents to enable children's participation in decision making in appropriate ways, rather than feeling that the only way to protect and prioritise children in a separation is to try and shield them from what is going on.
Parents and children valued support that they characterised as being accessible, informative, realistic, and emotionally aware. The development of new systems of support for families who are separating should consider how well all these criteria are met. We found that who got what support was quite haphazard. When parents had limited resources to draw on, whether they be material, emotional, or social, it made separating more challenging and more difficult for children. Policy developments should consider how a safety net of support can be developed for separating families, one that includes authoritative information, legal advice, and emotional support. Housing, both quality and location, has particular implications for children's living arrangements and well-being and should not be overlooked. Parents we spoke to talked about trying really hard to protect their children from any distress of separation, even though this could be really difficult for them as parents emotionally. However, parents' attempts to be protective did not always match up with what children told us they needed in terms of timely information and involvement in making decisions. So more thought needs to be given about how we support parents to help their children through the process by hearing their wishes and feelings and providing them with age-appropriate information. Our findings about mediation suggest we need to think more carefully about the binary model of court or mediation as the options for support that are available. Parents had very mixed experiences of mediation. Sometimes this related to misplaced expectations, suggesting information could be made clearer. But also, and concerningly, some of those we spoke to described mediation as failing to address unequal power dynamics in the relationship, or where domestic abuse had not been screened effectively. Our research suggests that further efforts to divert families from court should include development of offers beyond mediation, which focus more on practical advice, guidance, and emotional support for parents and their children, including directing them to where they can access financial or housing support. There should also be more work undertaken to ensure that all parts of the support system available to families screen effectively for domestic abuse. Court was commonly described by parents as a last resort rather than as a preferred means of resolving disputes. When thinking about court reform and understanding the families who do use the court system, we need to understand their experiences in that context. Where families did use the court, even though parents appreciated the granting of court orders, in other words, the outcome, the experience of the process was felt to be largely negative by parents and children alike. Our research suggests it would be helpful if court language and court processes could be reviewed to be more accessible, informative, realistic, and emotionally aware, in line with what families told us they value from other services. Children and young people told us the importance of having their voices heard. And in light of this, we would support consideration of how children could be included earlier in the process in order to feel that their views have been included in decision making. We are hugely grateful to the children and parents who gave up their time to share their experiences with us. We hope their stories will help all professionals who engage with separating families think about what could be done differently to support them better in the future.
Thank you very much to the University of Bristol team for that presentation, and of course to the families who took part in the research. So I'm now joined by Dr. John Simons, Dr. Eleanor Staples and Professor Esther Dermott to take questions from you, our audience. I can see from the chat there's been a huge amount of comments and questions. So I'm going to try and rattle through as many questions as we can. And I'm going to ask for pithy answers from our panel, please. I want to start, though, by asking John about the research, because this is an important question that people have asked us in advance of today's event. How representative is the research? So we heard that the study group was quite small. So how confident are you that the research really is representative of separating parents as a whole? Sorry, John, I'm afraid I can't hear you. I'm still not hearing John very clearly, so I'm going to ask a question of another member of our panel in the hope that we can come back to that first question to John once we've sorted that problem. We've had a lot of questions in the chat while the presentations were being made about children's experiences of separation and what can be done to really help parents to explain the processes and support their children through, particularly through proceedings, but also separation more generally. I wonder if I could put that question, please, to Eleanor.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me, first of all?
Perfect.
Yes. Okay, good. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so I suppose I quite like to start with a positive, actually, because children in the study, there were children in the study who spoke positively about their experience of the way their parents handled the separation. And sometimes it is useful to look to the strengths when thinking about ways forward, because it is easy to kind of get sucked into the negativity. So parents who spoke to their children clearly and in age-appropriate ways early on in the separation, and also at different time points as things developed, as children grew into young people, you know, grew into older young people. And one of the key things that children reported being positive about the way their parents supported them through the separation was where parents kept the topic open. So, you know, a topic that could be revisited at any point, and children could tell when their parents meant that it was a topic that was kind of on the table whenever they wanted to revisit it. On the other hand, unfortunately, and I did see a comment in the chat on this, we did also have quite a large number of children who couldn't tell me when their parents separated or why, or, you know, that very basic early information was missing for many children. And as a first step, that would be really important to educate parents about the importance of telling children that their parents are separating. In terms of sort of supporting parents, I think there's a little bit of acknowledging difficult feelings, and that they are feeling difficult feelings, that their children may be feeling difficult feelings. But that doesn't mean that it's not okay to kind of talk about it. And again, I saw someone had put in the chat something about kind of emotion coaching, and those kinds of approaches might be quite useful. But it does tie into wider findings from the study about the availability of information, having information in one place so that parents feel comfortable with having those difficult conversations with their children, which is not, in some cases is not an easy thing. And I think it's important for us to state that this study, while I know there's lots of concern around high conflict, separation, and cases that the family court will see, our study was trying to look at the everyday separation, those separations that don't come anywhere near court, the kind of everyday experience of children and families. And in many cases, parents are doing a good job, but I think there is need for pulling together some information to give parents confidence just about having those difficult conversations and listening to children's difficult emotions too.
Thank you. I mean, that was a big theme through the research and your recommendations, the need to help people to navigate the various forms of support pre-court. I wanted to ask Esther a bit about what you found in the research in terms of parents' understanding of the process. How much did the parents that you spoke to understand the legal processes, and were they aware of where to go to for help?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you fine.
Good, right. I mean, the short answer to that, you said to be pithy, is that parents didn't really seem to understand legal processes very well. Not much at all. The resources they tended to go to, so they would go to the internet, but not many of those were very authoritative resources. So the one exception, to go back to Eleanor's point about emphasising the positive, is the child maintenance calculator was found useful for a lot of parents, but parents then tended to rely on friends and family. And obviously that knowledge varied hugely depending on the kinds of social resources, how knowledgeable those friends and family actually were. So it was a very mixed picture, and actually they had relatively little knowledge about the legal process. Some of that was impacted by resources. So people who could pay for a solicitor obviously had much better legal knowledge than those who didn't, or they might have a friend, so they had other ways of getting information about the solicitor and legal, but it was very unequal. So some of the things that might be responsible for that, and again, I think these align with other pieces of research as well, a lack of legal aid, difficulty in finding signposting, so that there's what's the one-stop shop to go to, and also that individual needs obviously differ quite a lot and at different points in time. So what parents were looking for was someone to talk to about their particular situation, and while legally those might be the same, they didn't feel that they were in the same situation or the particular dynamics. So I think one of the findings from the research is really that it's not just about putting information out there and hoping that parents will be able to navigate their way through it, but actually somebody who can lead you through some of those processes, somebody or something that can help you navigate that. And that's where sometimes individuals or solicitors might help with that, but lots of the time parents felt that they were trying to make it up or kind of find their way very much on their own.
And one of the questions in the chat earlier was, could the court be doing more to help signpost people to services? Are you saying that that's too late in the process?
Well, as Eleanor mentioned before, obviously lots of the people that we spoke to weren't ending up in court anyway. And I think that given the desire to make sure that people don't end up in court unless they really need to, that's probably not the place to do that. As we said, maybe it is worth reiterating that parents only went to court when they felt they didn't have any other options, when they'd run out of options. It may be that if they had different advice, they would have not ended up in court, but they felt that they only ended up there when they really had to. One of the other things, I think there's been probably quite a lot of emphasis about the role of judges and magistrates to assist parents, about how judges and magistrates speak to parents. And obviously that could be positive, and how they could speak to everybody who's involved. However, I think one of the findings of our research was really that those individual responses are not going to address the structural, the spatial issues of court processes and legal processes. So perhaps we shouldn't put too much weight on what individual judges and magistrates can do in these situations.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn to mediation now. There's been lots of questions about that. I'm wondering whether John's audio is back.
Hi, is that better,
Yeah,
Lisa?
that's much better. Well, let me go back to the first question I asked you first of all, because I think people need to understand. Is this research representative?
So no, we haven't set out to make it representative of the experiences of all separated parents. You'd need different kinds of studies that do that, so larger surveys or administrative data sets. But what you don't get in those studies is you're a bit more limited in the level of detail that you can ask people about. So we deliberately set out to design a qualitative study, and that involves speaking to a relatively small number of people, but it allows you to ask much more detailed questions about their experiences. So for this study, we were able then to explore with families about what people appreciated or they found difficult in the process of separating, what support they found helpful or difficult. And that kind of thing is valuable because it can tell us how and why things happen, rather than kind of how many people had a certain outcome. So that's the reason for that.
Thank you. So let me ask you about mediation, because as you set out in that presentation, there was quite mixed experience of mediation, in some cases quite negative experiences. What do we know about what mediation was accessed by the families in the research? You know, were the mediators registered with the Family Mediation Council? Was there child inclusive mediation involved? You know, what did the families say about the quality of the mediation?
Sure. I mean, it's worth saying up front that the focus of the study was around the experiences of families through that process. So we weren't setting out to look at a particular form of support or to critique a particular form of support. Although when mediation did come up, it was something that parents kind of wanted to tell us about and expanded on. Parents weren't able to be clear with us and didn't often know whether mediators were accredited or registered with different bodies. And so the answer from us is that we don't know kind of the types of mediator that they spoke to, or kind of what the part of the process always they met be. So, for example, some parents told us that they found mediators by kind of looking online themselves, and maybe they'd heard that this was a good thing to do from family or friends. Some parents understood that it was a requirement, and so kind of took it on themselves. Other people had been referred by their solicitor, and a couple of parents told us that they'd kind of accessed mediators through the court. So it was quite a confusing picture for us, and I think it reflects the confusing picture for some parents about kind of who they need to speak to and what the formal status of that is at different parts of the process.
There's been quite a lot of comment on the chat about domestic abuse, which obviously features highly in cases that get to court. Did you know, or did families disclose domestic abuse to the researchers? Was that part of the picture you were looking at?
So it came up in a small number of interviews. There were a couple of interviews I remember in particular, and for one of those, that was a reason why the couple didn't go to mediation. So that's probably an example of where that screening process had worked quite well. The other example was different, and the mother talked to us about it being a very distressing experience being in mediation, and that there had been domestic abuse. So we don't know what the overall picture is about how often that happens, but it speaks to us about trying to tighten up some areas of the system so that we can ensure that it's working well in all instances, so that we can make it work better for everybody.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to some of the questions that have been put about children, but we talked about what they know about separation. I want to ask Eleanor a bit more about their voice in proceedings, and how we can strengthen children's voice through the process. What do we draw from the research around children's voice in proceedings and related services?
So we didn't speak to any children or young people who had been kind of physically present in proceedings, so we couldn't really comment on that particular aspect, but in general, in relation to kind of any adult who was involved in the family separation, children report wanting clear information and an opportunity to be listened to, and that doesn't, and their agency respected as appropriate for the age and stage of the child. And that doesn't mean doing what the child wants, but it does mean engaging in good faith in a dialogue with a child, listening to what they want, and if it can't happen because parents decide against it or the court decides against it, you know, whatever the context of the separation, then it involves explaining why not, why their desire for something to happen can't happen or won't happen. And I think that's really important, that we distinguish between, or we understand children's agency and participation and voice not as an unqualified a response in an unqualified way to putting into place what a child wants, but it does mean listening actively, understanding that children are very much involved in the family separation and cannot be kind of parcelled off or shut out of it, and also holding in the balance that children's wishes and feelings are dynamic and change over time, particularly around kind of adolescence and that burgeoning need for independence, which may mean that their decisions about who they stay with, for example, change. And in our study, children spoke very positively about their encounters with CAFCAS because they felt that they were child-centred and that they were clear in communication, and in some cases the family court advisor was the only person that they felt had listened to them.
So interesting, and such an important set of issues you've raised there. I'm conscious of time, so I'm sort of trying to keep on top of a lot of questions that have come in. I want to go back to Esther really and talk about something that sort of underlies a lot of your findings around resources and parents' access to resources and how that dictates the support they can get. How much does poverty impact the way that parents approach separation, and what does this mean for what we should be thinking about in terms of future support?
Thanks. Yes. Thanks very much, Lisa, for raising that. So I don't think anybody on the call here is going to be able to address major issues of poverty and those kind of societal level problems. However, I think it is important, and I think our research shows this, for anybody involved in any of the processes at any stage to be aware of the dynamics and the importance of poverty, that it just, in one level, it makes everything more difficult. So the ability to have housing that is better for the parents, better for children, is more limited. All of the choices are more restricted. Parents couldn't afford to buy in support, whether that's counselling or whether it's legal advice. The options were more restricted, and that just made everything a bit more difficult. Not saying that for those who aren't living in poverty, separation or divorce is an easy process, but it took having some financial resources and having some social capital as well meant that things could be navigated a little bit more easily. And I think that that's probably important for people then, a sense of thinking that parents might be not doing their best and not doing the best by children, but that often there are resource implications which are getting in the way of parents being able to do what they would like to do. And one of the elements is that we talk about separation being a process, which was mentioned by Sir Andrew at the beginning as well. And of course it is a process, and in some ways separation is never complete for parents who will be engaging in some distance way with an ex-partner, perhaps over their child's whole life. But it's much easier to separate the elements that you want to separate more quickly if you have some financial resources. So we had examples of parents who, for example, had to live in the same house as their ex-partner for a couple of years before they were able to move away. And that's one example that just makes things harder, probably for everybody involved. So I think it is really important for people to bear it in mind, even whenever we can't all come up with solutions to resolve it.
Thank you so much to the team. I'm really afraid that was all we've got time for in terms of the discussion, and I'm really conscious of the comments and the questions that have been flooding in through the chat. It's been very lively on the chat. I'd like to thank everyone who's contributed to the webinar, including Sir Andrew McFarlane, Dr. John Simons, Dr. Eleanor Staples, and Professor Esther Dermott, and of course to all the families who shared their experiences in the research. But thank you also to you all for attending and for the lively discussion that's been taking place online. If you'd like to find out more about the research that's been presented today, it can be downloaded from our website. To remind you, that's nuffieldfjo.org.uk, and you'll see a link in the chat. We've also created an infographic on the research, which will be available on our website, and you can see a preview of that infographic at the end of this webinar. If you'd like to sign up to receive our regular bulletins, which contains information about all our latest research and upcoming events, you can do so at nuffieldfjo.org.uk/subscribe. Again, there'll be a link in the chat. And finally, we'd be really grateful if you could just spend the last minute or so of the webinar to fill in the feedback form so we can learn from your experience of today's event. We do take all your comments really seriously and reflect and develop our events in light of what you tell us. We really look forward to welcoming you to future events, and thank you all very much.